Did REvil ruin your Independence Day?
Hey, Manish. Looks like you're bringing a story to us this week about probably the most monumental ransomware attack I think we've seen to date.
That's right, Manny. This long weekend was not an enjoyable weekend for many out there. Unfortunately, Friday afternoon, Kaseya Software sent out a message saying that they're looking into a possible supply chain attack, and that was responsible for deploying REvil ransomware onto the endpoints. So it came in the form of what's believed to be a fake VSA update, and it seemed like it was unclear in the beginning, but I think it's been confirmed since that it's been only impacting on-prem VSA servers. So Kaseya is a company that they provide unified remote management and monitoring tools. So a lot of managed service providers use them to automate IT process. They'll deploy patches, they control authentication and access for their clients downstream. So the way that their software works, it requires a high level of trust, to be able to do that on their clients' systems. And because of that, a lot of that was leveraged to deploy this ransomware, using the Kaseya software out onto, hundreds of different um, companies out there throughout the world. So, in the end, it turns out that there was no evidence of any compromise at Kaseya's, on Kaseya's VSA code base, and it ended up being a zero-day exploit on, what was it was on their VSA servers, which was deployed on-prem, right? So using that, it allowed the zero-day exploits allowed the attackers to bypass authentication and run arbitrary code, which ultimately led to deploying ransomware onto their clients' endpoints. So, and as I said, Kaseya, after their investigation, there's no impact to customers that were using their cloud BSA service. So it's just the on-prem customers currently at this time. So basically what happened is the vulnerability, it allowed the attackers the initial access, and because of that and the way the software works, you know that access and which leveraged the trust that software has and the exclusions granted to the VSA server, it really allowed them to take hold of this entire process and deploy it throughout many different clients that were managed by these MSPs, right? So kind of the way it worked was the Kaseya endpoint agent, it fetched the fake software update from the VSA server that was already compromised, and basically, instead of a software update for Kaseya, it ended up being being like a PowerShell script, which downloaded some additional tools and things like that, which eventually led to encrypting a lot of the endpoints. So the once that software update came down through the Kaseya endpoint agent, which it turned out to be basically a PowerShell script that disabled all of the anti-ransomware protections from Microsoft Defender. So it deploys this agent.exe file, which is and it was written into the Kaseya working folder. And by doing that, that also allowed it to be kind of not looked at by a lot of the built-in anti-malware tools that would have been on the system itself, because that Kaseya working folder is one of the exclusions, because it needs to use that, because the software needs to use that to kind of process a lot of things and it has a lot of those escalated privileges. So after that agent.exe file was it was actually started by Kaseya's agentmon.exe process. And by doing that, it inherited all of the system level privileges. And it drops a file called mspeng.exe, which is actually an outdated version of Microsoft's anti-malware service executable. It's an application from Microsoft Defender, And there's a vulnerability in that older version that allows for a side loading attack. So they basically were able to side load a file called mpsvc.dll into the memory space and have it executed by mspeng.exe, which is that outdated Microsoft Defender application. So at that point, that's when that file starts to encrypt the local disk. It's encrypting the local disk. It encrypts the removable drives, any map network drives, and and that's how from they're considering it a supply. Technically, it wasn't a supply chain attack because it wasn't necessarily any sort of like software updates from Kaseya, but it was more because of this vulnerability in the Kaseya software and the server software. But they're still, because it's a tool that's used by managed software providers, they're considering it a supply chain attack. And there's a couple things that kind of stand out. So I was reading a Sophos article. So the first thing is that there was really no attempt to exfiltrate any of the data from the victims, all of those downstream clients of these managed service providers. And it's likely because of like the large scale of this attack. There's like hundreds of companies downstream that were impacted by it. The second thing about it is they kind of had some, they were able to tailor the attacks based on the size of the company. So smaller companies had a different sort of attack versus a larger company. So that means they kind of these attackers must have had access to the VSA server to because they were able to identify the individual customers that these managed service providers were providing services to. And finally, one of the last things is that there was no attempt to delete any volume shadow copies, because that's one of the things that, a lot of most other defenses in place now, they look for those types of things because it's very common for ransomware to, to do that. So that's one of the things that would have triggered on a lot of endpoints. The final thing, it's very smart of them to pick this long weekend to deploy this attack. A lot of people had probably on vacation already or had left early for the day. So it was a critical time to deploy this ransomware. And the REvil has, they put out there that, they'd be willing to provide the universal decryption key for like, I think $70 million, and they brought it down to $50 million. But the other thing is, they'll, whether anyone pays that, it's a guess, probably not. But there's also the individual companies that have been impacted that they may end up paying. So it's a pretty massive attack, very, very deployed and pulled off very, very well, very coordinated. So I think there's going to be a lot of changes in the upcoming future to how these companies that deploy these types of software are treated. And I think it just puts a lot of pressure on these companies to do a better job at making sure that the software that they're providing has been vetted, that the vulnerabilities that that get come out that they're taken care of on a really timely fashion, really quickly and thoroughly. And the other thing is, I can imagine that a lot of these bug bounty programs are they're going to have to increase the payouts because, especially for companies like Kaseya, to find these vulnerabilities from, the good guys as opposed to the bad actors.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think you look at that and you said, the universal decryptor key that you were talking about that they're asking $50 million for now. I saw that, as you said, I don't think there's going to be an individual company that's going to dish out the 50 million unless you have a cyber insurance policy that's going to pay out that way. And and quite frankly, I just don't think that that's going to happen. And
Right.
We have a story later on to talk about some of that stuff. But I saw that at bare minimum they were asking 45,000. I think for basically right. The mom and pop shop was going to have to pay 45 grand to get their files decrypted. So I would imagine that you're going to have, because you're talking about hundreds of companies here, you're going to have, like, hey, if I'm a smaller company and I think I can get out of this thing by paying $45,000 and getting my stuff out of here, they might do it, right? And if they have their own cyber insurance, it might be really easy for them to just say 45, I'm out. I'm not going to wait around for somebody else to pay the, So it'll be interesting to see over the next couple of weeks how this all plays out. But there will be a lot that kind of comes out of this particular, attack.
Right. I think one of the other issues I've been reading that there's a lot of politicians that are very against paying these ransomwares, because it just kind of takes that problem and turns it into a cycle where it's just never ending, right? If people are paying for it, they're going to continue doing it. So we may see some change in like legislation, at least in the United States, where it would be illegal for a company to pay out ransomware. So I know there's obviously a lot of recently a lot of oversight by the U.S. government on ransomware. So it just remains to be seen how things what changes.
I would say one of the things that kind of stood out to me about this, that's a differentiator from a lot of the other ransomware attacks that we've seen, is because they targeted Kaseya, which is actually like a system administration tool. So you would use that to kind of push patches out to your endpoints and do system administrative type functions.
Right.
Because it was deployed through that or via that server, impacting that one, a lot of endpoint solutions, like you said, and you kind of mentioned this, that most endpoint antivirus solutions are going to ignore anything that goes on with Kaseya, because it's kind of a trusted entity. Like, we're just going to basically kind of blindly trust it, saying that stuff that runs out of this directory or as a result of the Kaseya endpoint process is okay, because it's supposed to be doing these types of very elevated privilege type system administration functions on the endpoint devices. So to me, that's kind of like a real differentiator, because a lot of the stuff we see before is it's, maybe ransomware coming in through an email into an individual endpoint, or maybe it'll even laterally move out into servers and whatnot. But it takes a lot more work. With this, it's almost, you can get on here and you have a platform, so to speak, to distribute your ransomware to other endpoints if you really wanted to. I don't know that they actually did that or they got that far, but certainly on the VSA servers themselves, there was a lot of capabilities to do that kind of thing. So to me, that's an interesting kind of differentiator that I would be paying attention to as, a business or a company or even a security researcher, that hopefully this is like the new thing that they're looking for, is like, what other weaknesses can we find in similar products that have escalated privileges already?
Right. And it's a very elegant solution to deploy your ransomware to as many companies and many endpoints as possible. Like, to have that reach through one aspect is pretty serious. And like you said, the Kaseya software, basically, if it's being performed by Kaseya, the endpoint just ignores, all of it, doesn't think it's anything malicious, and doesn't do anything about it, unfortunately.
And in fact, I already know, if you go and look out on the internet at various endpoint solutions like FireEye, SentinelOne, a lot of other, they have kind of guidelines of, you might need to whitelist Kaseya and this subdirectory in order to prevent false positive detection.
Right.
So, a lot of these endpoint products have guidance or stuff already built in to whitelist other products that do similar types of things, which is understandable. But, again, because of the elevated privileges, it's something I would be concerned about.
Right. So, I mean, if you're an attacker, you can just go to these endpoint products, like their documentation, and just kind of find those different avenues of things that need to be whitelisted, like Kaseya, and then focus your efforts on finding vulnerabilities into those, into that software. Which, obviously they had known about this. This is a 0-day vulnerability that they were able to exploit. So they obviously knew about this, and it just, hopefully eventually it comes out how they found out. Were they able to buy this access to this vulnerability through the open market? Do they have individuals on their own team that are able to go out there and hunt for these vulnerabilities? Reverse all these tools and things like that to find these vulnerabilities and things like that. it's kind of interesting, and hopefully we find that out eventually.
So Manish, I guess thinking about this, this whole story and trying to provide at least some guidance for anybody who may have been impacted, who may not be in the know at this point, and hopefully you are. But if you're not, what's I guess the process right now, or what is there any information that we can give in terms of getting yourself back? How do you protect yourself? What can you do?
Sure. So Kaseya had released I think 2 separate PowerShell scripts. One is for an endpoint, and one is for the actual VSA server, where you can run that to see if you've been, it just kind of tells you if you've been impacted by the ransomware. And the other thing is, I believe, maybe possibly today, sometime later in the afternoon, Kaseya will be releasing a patch for the servers. So obviously you would want to, at this point, I think if you've been impacted, you've been instructed to not turn your VSA server back on until further notice. So likely what you'd have to do is patch it, and then before you are able to connect it back to the network once the patch is released. So I think those are some of the things that you can do. Obviously, the other things that you could possibly do is if you have any other sort of endpoint monitoring in place, you can kind of start looking for these. I know there's a couple of different PowerShell scripts out there on the internet that you can find that you can run, including the one from Kaseya, to see if there's any indicators that are out there.
I would also throw in there, one thing you could do, even if you're not a victim, is to prepare yourself for any future ransomware cases, because there's a lot of, we're going to talk about 2 other stories, I think, related to ransomware today. And, having a really good patch management process is very important. Also having a really good backup strategy and exercising that from a disaster recovery perspective to say, okay, let's pretend that we had a ransomware event and see if we can actually recover from our backups. And try that, maybe on a yearly or even more regular basis. There's probably a lot of other types of things that people could do. Those are the 2 that come to mind. And I'm sure there's a lot of other guidance out there. But, having a good, being prepared for hopefully an event that's never going to occur to you is always the best strategy. So.
Right. And I think as far as backups, I think it's been recommended have at least 2 separate backups, one on-prem and one off-prem.
And another one is go figure out if you're if you should be investing in some cyber insurance. Yep.
Right. Even though I realize it can be a timely process, recovering from your own backup strategy could take 10 times as long as paying the ransomer and getting some decryption key that will just unlock everything for you very quickly and easily. So, that's where these critical services like healthcare and oil and gas and whatnot, they struggle on what's the right solution because they need to get themselves back in business as quick as possible.